When I was about maybe 7 years old, I used to go to my grandma's house all the time. She'd pick us up from school. It was always myself, two of my cousins, and my brother. She was basically the one that watched us all the weekdays. And so about when I was 7, we were all there. It was the same crew that normally was there. And I had been inside for the duration of this day. So I actually didn't know that everybody was outside and rushed inside in a panic because I had already been inside. My grandma was on the phone, so she didn't notice as I, in as much ignorance as humanly possible, decided, I'm going to go in the backyard and play on the swing set. And so now that everybody's rushed in, I'm going outside onto the swing set, and it's on my way to the swing set that I realized why my grandma was now poking her head out the door at me and screaming at me to come back inside. Because I looked down next to me, and there was a snake like literally maybe 6 inches from my foot. But me, in my little 7-year-old brain, I'm like, it's green. That's probably fine. And so I just proceeded to the playground, went to go play on the swing set, and eventually the guy who my grandma was on the phone with, he showed up to catch the snake, take it out of her yard, and get rid of it, and all of that. Now, why do I tell you this? It's because there is a peace that comes from utter ignorance, right? We can agree with that, right? Like that was me. We know that. And if you don't know that, then never mind. But like there I was in this moment, standing next to the snake, and yet I was the only one in this entire scenario who was at peace. Everybody else was panicking. Everybody else decided there's a snake on the property. We're all going to die, and it's going to be the worst. And I'm like, it's green. It's fine. I'm pretty sure that's how snakes work. But ultimately, what we know is this wasn't real peace, right? This wasn't real peace. This was just a boatload of ignorance, which is my life. But what we find as we start to dig into the scriptures, and as we spend this week looking at the peace of Jesus, is we find that the peace of Jesus is very different. We find that the way that the peace of Jesus comes to us it's a fundamentally different kind of peace. So we're going to be jumping around in the scriptures a little bit this morning, but if you've got your Bibles, we're going to start in Luke chapter 2, which is great because this is where we already were for the candle reading, but we're going to start in Luke 2, jump a little bit down, and we're going to be in verses 25 through 31. It says here in Luke 2:25, now, there was a man in Jerusalem called Simeon, who was righteous and devout. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit was on him. It had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not die before he had seen the Lord's Messiah. Moved by the Spirit, he went into the temple courts. When the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him what the custom of the law required, Simeon took him in his arms and praised God, saying, "Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you may now dismiss your servant in peace. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all nations, a light for revelation to the Gentiles, and the glory of your people Israel." See, while my entire family was panicking about the snake in the backyard, what happened to them is they were frozen in place in the house. Right? Everybody rushed into the house to lock the doors and freeze and to be in isolation. It is in response to seeing Jesus that Simeon can now move forward in what he's doing. Right? Do you see how Simeon says it's now in peace that you can release your servant can move on? You know, one of my favorite things about preaching and teaching is that how often actually I don't realize something until it's maybe in the study process, it's in the writing process, sometimes in the preaching process that something pops out to me and I'm like, oh, that's really cool, God. I hadn't noticed that, right? This is something that's happened in this series to me. Here's the interesting thing that I found. Whether we've been talking about hope, about joy, about peace, I've realized that there is a fundamental component of how these are gifts from God given to us so that we may experience life to the fullest. Have you noticed that? Like each time when I start to break these down, I start to realize, oh, Jesus came so that this component could be fulfilled so that we could have life to the fullest. Literally what he talked about in John chapter 10, right? We realized that it's a lack of hope that can cause us to stop and to wonder why God seems to have forgotten about us. And it's almost this picture of the prophet Jeremiah who was dropped into a cistern that's dark and muddy and damp. And we live in that area when we don't have hope. We saw a lack of joy, which works like a lack of light, and how it's as if we're walking around in the darkness, scared of what we may stumble over, scared of what we may bump into, and so we simply freeze in the darkness. And then we see that this lack of peace does something similar, because this lack of peace really kind of manifests as a place of fear. And so in response, we freeze, and what we do is we submit to that fear. This is the first fundamental truth about the peace of Jesus. Jesus provides a peace that moves us forward. It allows us to step out of that place of being frozen. Simeon, in this passage, Simeon was in the season of waiting, right? And is there anybody in here who enjoys waiting? Okay, if you raised your hand, you're... But we can agree collectively that waiting is the worst. Like I've made the joke before that we're bad at waiting on microwaves. We're like, I have to wait 1 minute? Are you kidding me? I was downloading something on like Starbucks Wi-Fi recently, and I'm like, this is going to take like 2 minutes? Are you kidding me? This be instant at my house. We're terrible at waiting. We hate waiting. But once again, what we find is that there are two different kinds of waiting, right? There's waiting like waiting for Christmas, where you're waiting in excitement, right? It's that feeling that you probably remember as a kid when you see the gifts under the tree, and now you have to wait until mom and dad are awake before you can open them, right? And that waiting that feels like forever, but it's that feeling of anticipation. Or that waiting as a parent, like I know where the presents are hidden in my house right now because I hid them, and I'm like, oh, I just want you guys to open them. I just want to give them to you. But if you open them, you're in trouble, right? And it's this waiting that's awful. But you can handle the waiting because you know that it's worth it. But then there's the second kind of waiting. See, one of the unique things about the town that I came from, I was in Hanford, which is right next to Lemoore. And Lemoore has a Navy base, which is weird, admittedly, because Lemoore does not have water in any sense of the understanding of that, but they have a Navy base. What this meant for us is that there were constantly families in our church whose loved ones were deployed, right? This is just the natural rhythm of life when you live in a Navy town. And I remember back in March of 2020, there was a significant COVID-19 outbreak on a U.S. Navy ship. And I knew people who had family on that ship, who had loved ones on that ship. Do you know what we knew about COVID in March of 2020? We knew nothing, right? We're trying to figure out, should we be scared? Should we not be scared? Is it fine? Is this the most dangerous thing that's ever happened in the history of humanity and we all need to be panicking, right? Like we didn't know what to do with this. Then July of 2020 comes, the same year, and there was a Navy ship that caught on fire. And I knew people who had family on that ship. And that ship led to dozens of injuries. And I remember, ultimately, what I remember in 2020 with these families is I remember these moments because of the waiting, right? I remember people in my church who were stuck waiting to hear from their loved ones, waiting to hear if they would receive that call, waiting to hear what's happened. Are they okay? Would they ever hear from them again? See, there's the waiting and excitement, and that's bearable because we know it's worth it. And then there's the waiting and fear, uncertainty, unknown. That's the hard waiting. That's the kind of waiting that rattles your peace. And what do you do in those moments? Oftentimes we get stuck, right? Oftentimes, here's what we do, is we look for the hamster wheel And we just think that if I can just put my head down and keep going, it'll distract me from all the chaos in my life. And what happens is we lose our ability to truly live and enjoy life. But when Simeon got to see Jesus, he got to hold that little baby in his arms. You can almost, without the text even saying it, you can almost just hear the deep sigh of relief that he would have breathed the moment he got to hold that little baby. Simeon didn't need to see this boy all grown up becoming the mighty King of David, who frees all his people from their sins and redeems all of creation under his rule. He didn't get to see any of that. He didn't need to see any of that. He just needed to see the infant who God promised. That was enough for him. And when he saw that, he spoke to God and he said, "You can dismiss your servant in peace." He was ready to move on. He was ready for the next phase in life. This is the peace that Christmas brings. That without seeing all the triumph of Jesus, just to see that little baby, it's our reminder of the peace that this God brings. This peace that enables us to let go of fear and to move forward in our lives, no matter how scary we've decided the next phase of our life is. St. Augustine said this. He said, quote, "Peace is the tranquility of order." Or in other words, peace is when there is a calmness due to a lack of chaos. That makes sense, right? There's not chaos, it's calm, that's peace. Which, listen, sounds great, but listen, Augustine, you haven't been here for a little while, right? You've been dead for a little while. You haven't seen the place where the world's gotten. You didn't get to see the 2024 election and how all that went down. So I don't know, but listen, it seems a little chaotic to me, right? Like I look around and things are pretty chaotic. So how in the world am I supposed to have peace if there's so much chaos? Like, do we just give up on this idea of peace? And we're just giving over to chaos? But this is where Simeon and his story comes in. He helps us to see the greater expression that Augustine was trying to reveal. Simeon did not yet see the order of Jesus. Right? When we talk about order and we talk about Simeon didn't see order, right? Like Simeon still lived under Roman oppression. There was no tranquility. The closest thing to order was Caesar saying that, hey, if you don't calm down, I will kill you. That was order. That's what he lived in. And yet, Augustine realized the deeper reason that Simeon was able to have peace in the midst of all of this. See, peace is not just the absence of war or strife when we look around at all the things of the world, but it's the presence of a proper alignment with God's will. This is something that starts internally, something that starts in us. This true peace exists when our hearts, relationships, societies are ordered according to God's purposes. And it results in this deep and abiding tranquility. And listen, when I say our hearts, our relationships, and our societies, we hear hearts and we're like, okay, we can have peace there. Our relationships, we can maybe figure that out once Christmas is over. And then our societies, and we're like, ugh. But listen, we start in the smaller areas, right? This is why it starts in our heart. This is just you. Can you trust God enough for peace? And then it goes from there to our relationships. And then to our societies. Listen, your society, let's first and foremost think about your oikos, right? Those 8 to 15 people who God has strategically placed in your life for you to share the gospel with them. Can you have peace there? And then it starts to trickle out, right? This is how this works. And so by getting to hold that little baby boy, Simeon was able to recognize that God is on the move, that God is doing something. And as someone who follows God, as a follower, Simeon can be on the move too. See, every Christmas we're reminded of this truth, that we can embrace the peace that God is ordering all things to himself and to his will. And if we are also willing to allow ourselves to be ordered to him and his will, then we can live fully with that peace in our lives. We can live in that peace, and then we can move forward. We don't have to be frozen in fear. we can step into the things that God has for us. But then we run into another problem. What about when we're supposed to stay still? Right? Because you talk about moving forward, and then somebody in here, I don't know who, but somebody is thinking, what about that verse that says, be still and know that I'm God? Right? Well, let's talk about it. See, have you ever tried to be still and also be at peace? It's not easy, right? Like, this is the idea of inertia. It's a science word for those of you who don't like science. If people talk math words to me, I'm out. So I understand that. But this is like if you have been living your life at a sprinting pace, right? You are somebody who cannot say no to anything. You're involved in too many things. And so you are sprinting and sprinting and sprinting. It is going to feel absolutely impossible to experience peace in the stillness. You're going to find yourself thinking of all the things that you need to do. Ultimately, what you're going to find is you're going to find yourself thinking about all the things that you feel you need to control. And you're not going to be able to sit in peace. And so this is why Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 and 7, it says this. It says, do not be anxious about anything. That's already impossible, right? I'm like, whoa, okay. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. See, it is when we take the time to slow down, take a breath, that we start to realize just how loud our inner life is and how busy the world is around us. This is like trying to have peace in those moments when you have family deployed and you're waiting, hoping for a call. This is like trying to have peace in the moments when you're waiting for the results of a biopsy. Right? I've told this story before, so I won't share in as much detail, but when we were having Felicity, our oldest child, basically everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong. Katie's placenta ruptured, and that caused her to be in extreme pain while giving birth. I remember they were monitoring the baby's heartbeat, and I remember having that little computer screen with the green line on it that's supposed to be going up and down, and instead it's a flat bar. And I remember seeing that flat bar for what felt like an eternity. And the nurses, they rushed in, and they were clearly panicked in this moment. Do you know how hard it is to hold it together when the nurses are panicked? Like when the professionals who tell you to calm down are like, I am not calm right now. Something is wrong and I don't know what to do. That was us in this moment. Our doctor was gone. He was like, hey, I'm going to Visalia. This is probably going to take a whole day, so I'll be back with plenty of time. That was like an hour ago that he said that. And so he was gone. So now the nurses are literally sprinting, calling on the intercom, yelling out, looking for a doctor. Right? This is literally what's happening. When the doctor finally got in our room, he said that Katie needed to be taken for an emergency C-section. And so they were wheeling her out of the room while Katie is screaming in pain. And the last nurse turns and looks at me and says, this is too much of an emergency. You have to stay here. And they leave. And now there I am, all by myself, just fully alone in this moment. And listen, Katie had the harder job, right? Like I'm not trying to take that from her. But I'm sitting in this room completely and utterly alone. Like the sheer just panic that was happening in there, the screaming that was happening in there. And then all of a sudden I'm in silence and I'm alone. Now initially I panicked so bad I had to get a bag and hold it to my face just in case, you know. But then the reality hit that I had prepared everything in my life for becoming a dad. I may not go home a dad today. Like that's literally what I was wrestling with. And yet somehow in the midst of that, for reasons that I cannot explain other than this passage, I just had this overwhelming feeling of peace. Like in the sense that you almost feel guilty. Like, am I allowed to feel this kind of peace right now? And the best way that I can describe what I went through is in that moment, I was completely alone until I realized that right there in the presence of all of this chaos, Jesus brings peace. And there he was. Like, it was right there in the birthing center at Adventist Health in Hanford, California, that Jesus met me and he held me. And I overwhelmingly knew that I was held and that I was loved. More than anything else in that moment, that's what I knew. That's the peace that Jesus brings. This peace that transcends understanding. Like, logically, I should not be at peace right now. I should be panicking. But this peace transcended understanding, and it guarded my heart in that moment. Because, man, my heart was vulnerable. My heart was scared. And yet my heart was held. This passage actually talks about in every situation entering into prayer and petition and giving our requests to God. And that's actually the last thing I remember doing before that overwhelming peace. Like, I suddenly realized that I need to be reaching out to family and telling them to pray. And so I'm like starting to text people. And then I'm like, wait a second, I should be praying. And so I stopped texting and I started just begging God, just pleading with God. And that's when the peace hit me. See, if Christmas is real, if you actually believe that Jesus came as a little baby in a manger, that means there is nothing off the table. That this God of the universe, this King of kings, Lord of lords, owns everything, needs, wants nothing, made the decision to step out of his throne room and into a dirty manger. There is nothing off the table for you to bring to him. It's all there. When life forces you to sit and wait in the most miserable circumstances, you can look to him for the answers. You can look to him for peace. And here's what I love. See, last week I mentioned people who have told me, they've said, Seth, there's nothing to worry about while I'm in the midst of a panic attack, right? And how little that helps. And we all know, hopefully, that does not work. We know that's like telling your wife to calm down in an argument, and you just don't do that. But this passage tells us that the peace of Jesus does not just guard our hearts, it guards our minds. That's what I need, right? Like, does anybody else's mind move faster than the pace at which you can worry, right? Like, your mind you're like, I'm not done worrying about this, and you've come up with 12 more things for me to worry about? That's my brain. My brain just spirals. It's like it looks for black holes and then chases after them. And yet this passage tells us that the peace of God guards our minds. That's incredible. Here's what Christmas does for us. Christmas reminds us that when God became a human being and was born into that manger, it was in that moment that God's most magnificent plan was coming to fruition. And yet, darkness was still at large. Evil had not been defeated. Suffering was still very real. But it was in that moment that we realized we can finally take a breath. You can finally be still enough to take a deep inhale and a deep exhale and just live. Just receive that peace. That you can let God guard your heart and your mind. So that we can know, even in the moments of stillness, that he's at work. See, it's hard to be still because we want to control everything. This is going to go wrong if I don't get up and do something about it. And so being in stillness and being able to be in peace and stillness is to say, literally, if I do nothing for the rest of my life, God still has this in control. God's not like worried that the world's going to slip out of his grasp and fall into oblivion. He's got it. He's got you. Your control doesn't matter that much to him. It's there more than anything for your discipleship, for you to learn how to love and to trust him, not for you to fix the world. That's on him. And he's got a better plan for you than that, for that anyway. See, do you know what I did to save my little baby girl when that machine started showing that flat green line for what felt like an eternity? Nothing. What could I do? I'm not a doctor. I pass out when people talk about blood. I don't even have to see it. Like, there's nothing I could do in that moment. Now, sure, listen, the doctors and the nurses, they worked hard to preserve their health. And I am forever grateful that they went to school and took far more classes than I did and paid lots of money for those classes so that they could be well educated and do what they needed to do to save my family, right? I am grateful for that. But I believe that long before any of that happened, that God knew it was going to happen and that God had a plan. You know what's crazy? Our original doctor wasn't very good at C-sections, but the one who was on site when all of this happened was an expert at C-sections. What are the odds? Right? It's almost like God knew what he was doing. It's almost as if God went before us and said, hey, take a breath. I've got this. I've got this. See, here's what I'm saying. It was in my stillness that God was able to do what he does best. And while God was at work, he was also seated right next to me. That's the incredible thing, that God was at work in that operating room, and simultaneously he was seated right next to me, holding me and assuring me, it's okay, Seth. You can breathe. You can breathe. See, sometimes we need peace to push us forward because we're stuck in the darkness, we're frozen in fear, and so we need to be pushed forward out of the waiting like Simeon so that we can move into the next phase of our lives. But sometimes, and I think this is especially true during the holidays, that we need peace that can hold us tight as we sit still. When there's nothing we can do, we can trust that the Prince of Peace is doing what only the Prince of Peace can do. See, once Katie and I came through to the other side, the side that we're now on, we realized that there is a story to tell of God's goodness. That people should know this. People should know how he held us and how he took care of us. There's something that we had to share because of the peace that God afforded to us. We realized that this peace isn't meant to be kept to ourselves, but that we were given this peace so that we can share it. Luke chapter 2, verses 13 and 14, this is what was read a little bit earlier. Suddenly a great company of heavenly hosts appeared with the angel, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth peace to those on whom his favor rests." When the angel said, "peace on earth," I want you to know that this was not just a statement that they were throwing out there, but rather this was a declaration of what the birth of Jesus was bringing. Peace on earth. And not only that, but this was a declaration of what we get to partner in with Jesus. All the things that Jesus is doing, all the goodness that he is bringing, and he invites us into that. That's what Christmas is. That God didn't sit up in his throne and say, "Don't worry, guys, I'll fix it all from up here." But that he came down to us and he said, would you come alongside me while I fix it? Would you partner with me while I fix it? When the time finally came for the Messiah to come from heaven, all of heaven rejoiced and they proclaimed the peace on earth that was still to come. They were declaring over creation what was going to be a result of the coming Jesus. And when the text says that the peace is coming on those whom favor rests, this is designed after a Hebrew idiom. That basically what this is saying is, it's talking about the people of God's good pleasure. Church, somehow, even in all of our brokenness, and knowing all that this would cost Jesus, he is able to delight in us. That's incredible. Listen, hear me out. Because of our sinfulness, our brokenness, we are the scum of the earth. We are awful, our sin is unbearable, and yet Jesus looks at you and says, "Mine." He looks at you and he has pleasure. He is so infatuated with you. Like that should overwhelm us, that Jesus can look at us in that way, and that he can call us into his family. And so here's what we do with this. See, as followers of Jesus, we do just that. We follow Jesus. We do as he did. And what we find that life is messy, and we get upset with people. We hold grudges. We forget the things that we're supposed to be about. And we start dividing our lives into who's in and who's out. Right? And then Christmas comes, Thanksgiving comes, and we sit around our family, and all this talk about peace is out the window because it's utter chaos. And I think that what we fail to realize sometimes is that as a church, when we come together every single week, it's almost like this happens all year round. We start to get agitated with each other. We start to get irritated with the thing that I can't believe he does that, and he does it every single week, right? Not me, obviously, it's you guys. And this is what we do. We start to get agitated. We start to get irritated. And we start to think about, well, these people are in my group and they agree with what I think about this thing. And these people are out. And we start to build these things. But again, this is why I think Jesus liked children so much. Because think about how the holidays go with children. Like, do you realize how many times a day my kids tell each other they're never going to play with each other ever again? Like, it is a regular occurrence in my house to hear them scream through sobs, "You're mean. I'm never playing with you again." And then do you know what happens? They find something that they like, and they're overwhelmed. I have to share this with my sibling, right? Like Parker's just got done screaming at Felicity, and he's like, "Felicity, come look at what I found in my video game. Come look at this. Will you play it?" I'm like, "You just said you'd never play with her again," right? This is why Jesus loved kids. They're so quick to forgive. And I think that ultimately here's what happens to us as we grow up. I think we struggle sharing the peace of God with those who need it because we're insecure. In the book, The Scandal of the Kingdom, Dallas Willard talks about this forgiveness of children and how children are willing to offer this forgiveness. And here's what he ended up saying about it. He says, quote, "Children who have not been deprived of their sense of worth can be relaxed, trusting, and spontaneous. But as they grow up, they learn they must defend and validate their worth and no longer live with the presumption that they will be loved and accepted. Many of us have much to learn and unlearn about ourselves and God in this area." Unquote. Do you see how all of this starts with our sense of worth? Do we perceive ourselves as worthy or not? Do we perceive ourselves as loved by others or not? When we're feeling self-conscious, what we do is we keep to ourselves. We isolate. But when we're secure in our identity and just how valuable that we are to God, that's when we can truly participate in the mission of God. Children don't worry about all the nuances of life and love. They live at a reckless pace. My wife literally texted me this morning that the kids, Parker, got feces all over everything, and while she's bathing him, Nora smacked her head on something. She just got rid of her 2 black eyes. Now she smacked her head on something again. Like, this is kids living at a reckless pace in life. This is what they do. They destroy everything in their path sometimes, and yet what that means is that they can love others at a reckless pace. Right? They dive into relationships, no thought of whether or not it's going to hurt them. They just love, and they forgive, and they enjoy. My daughter tells me all the time she's got a new best friend. I'm like, "Cool, what's her name?" "I don't know." "But she's my best friend, and I love her so much." Can you imagine living your life like that? That's a peace, church. That's peace, because it's in the absence of that peace that we are fearful, that we are guarded, and that we avoid. And when you have the overwhelming peace that God offers, you recognize that your calling on this earth is not to just sit and enjoy it. You start to see the world around you, and you see that the tranquility of order doesn't exist for the vast majority of people around you. And what should happen is you should be overwhelmed with this feeling of responsibility to go and share this peace with them. I think the church is far too often, we function as some sort of club, right? As if we're, sometimes we feel as if we are among the religious elite, and therefore the peace of God it's for us, right? No wonder they don't have peace. It's for us, right? We earned this. No, we didn't. But here's what I think actually happens more often. I think more often than that is that we just enjoy the peace of our little club so much that we're not even thinking about what's on the outside. We've lost sight of the real world. We've just kind of gotten caught in our own little bubble where things are going okay. And as long as I don't have to think about the outside, I'll be all right. See, I think that's what happens more often, is we far too often forget to think about those who have yet to experience the incredible goodness of God. But maybe more than any other time of year, this is your opportunity to share the peace of God with those around you, to share the peace of Christmas with those around you. They should be able to learn from you that there is a hope that should allow them to live in peace. But maybe more importantly, they should have a peace that comes from nothing more than your presence. In the same way that Jesus sat with me in that room, as people struggle, as people hurt, they should know that the people of God, that the people of the well, are people who are willing to say, hey, can I just sit with you in your hurt? Can I just be present? Can I just love you, whether it's hard or not? Because, see, it's precisely that reminds them of their sense of worth and allows them to be freed from their insecurity. In the same way that God has held us in all of our own brokenness. You can sit with those who don't know God or his peace. You have the opportunity to be a beacon of peace in the lives of those who only seem to know chaos. See, the angels declared peace on earth. They didn't declare peace on 2500 Claus Road to those on whom God's favor rests. Peace on earth, right? And the reason that we get to experience this peace is because somebody on the other side of the planet decided that peace was good enough to share with their friend, and that friend shared it with their friend, and so on and so on and so on, until somehow it ended up here in Modesto. And so if that's how it got to you, then isn't it only fair, only right, that we would share that peace with others who need it so much? 1 John chapter 4, verse 19 says, we love because he first loved us. As we acknowledge loving others by sharing the peace of God with them. Listen, I recognize that there may be someone here today who's never gotten to experience the peace of God because they've never known the reality of God's love for them. I want you to know, first and foremost, that he loved you first. He actually loves you far more than you could possibly fathom, flaws and all. He loves you so much that he became a baby and lived through all the suffering in this world to finally be put to death in one of the most brutal ways for the sake of all of your flaws. And after raising to newness of life, he invites you into that life by believing that he died on a cross and rose again from that grave. And he says, if you believe that and you confess with your mouth that he is Lord, so what Romans 10 chapter 9 says, you will be saved. I want you to know that is your invitation today. That if that's you after the service, I'm going to be available here up front. We've got prayer partners that'll be in the back, and we'd love to pray with you. We'd love to answer your questions. For all of us, there are 3 takeaways on what we should do with this peace of God. Number 1, embrace the stillness of God in seasons of waiting. We hate waiting. So embrace the way that God is still in those moments. Sit with him in those moments. When it's eating at you and you can feel yourself just wanting to go and to do and to do and to do and accomplish, recognize that God is still and sit with him in that. Number 2, surrender your worries to God in prayer. Sometimes I just convince myself, well, God knows everything, so that makes it easy not to pray. But what I find is it's actually in my sitting with God, telling him what I need to tell him, that I need to verbalize these things, that I need to get them to God. This is when Paul talks about in Philippians that peace that transcends all understanding. He tells us first to give everything to God in prayer. So surrender your worries to God in prayer. And number 3, celebrate and share God's peace with others. This is your opportunity to identify somebody. I'm certain you can think of somebody in your life who's experiencing chaos this Christmas instead of peace. Share the peace of God with them. Share the love of God with them. Sit in the stillness with them. Sit in the chaos with them, whatever that may be. So number 1, embrace the stillness of God in seasons of waiting. Surrender your worries to God in prayer, and celebrate and share the peace of God with others. Would you pray with me? God, we want to thank you this morning, first and foremost, for your goodness. We want to thank you also for your peace, that even no matter what the world looks like around us, no matter what our own homes look like, that you offer us peace. And God, sometimes we struggle with embracing that peace and we keep running back to the chaos. We keep trying to control things on our own, creating more chaos. God, would you just give us the moment to still ourselves, to take a breath, and to live in your peace. God, would you so overwhelm us here at the well with your peace that we can begin to celebrate it and to receive it with joy in a way that we can start to bring this peace out to others, those who need it most. And would you give us endurance in that, God? Would this Christmas season be a moment that you would use for the well to show your love to others? God, we love you, we praise you, and we thank you for the things that you have yet to even do in our lives. And it's in Jesus' perfect name that we pray. Amen.